Good evening. Welcome to the Fright Files. My name is Chris Harmon, but you can call me Dr. Fright. Tonight, you will hear stories of a headless horseman, of a mirror that sucks you in and never sets you free. You will hear of a dollhouse that has more than meets the eye. And in a most spine-chilling story, you will hear of the grinning man. Before we begin, you must ask yourself that one all-important question. Are you frightful, brave enough to make it all the way to the end? With that being said, I present to you our first story of the evening. I call this story The Mirror's Promise. In the village of a black hollow, where the nights were long and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, there was an old belief passed down through generations. Never, ever look into a mirror after midnight. The villagers whispered that mirrors were not merely objects that reflected the physical world, but portals to another place, where darkness and light twisted together, where something else resides, something waiting for the unwary to make a fatal mistake. Now you see, a little boy by the name of Oliver had never been one for superstition. He was a mischievous boy, full of life and curiosity, with little patience for the whispered warnings of old men and their anxious glances of mothers as they tucked their children into bed. He scoffed at the tales of the mirror's curse, told to frighten children into obedience, and delighted in mocking those who still believed. And then, yes, then, there's always a then, one cold, lonely night, as a thick fog rolled in from the moors, Oliver found himself alone in his small bedroom. The house, oh, so quiet. His parents long asleep, and the only sound was the steady ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. The hour was late, and the village was wrapped in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling in the cold. Oliver, bored and restless, remembered the stories he had heard, the warnings never to look into a mirror after midnight. He smirked at the thought. What harm could there be in a simple reflection? He decided in a fit of defiance to test the old superstition for himself. With a grin, he picked up the small oval mirror that sat on his bedside table. The frame was old and tarnished, the glass slightly warped with age. Holding it in his hand, he glanced at the clock. The hands crept towards midnight, each tick of the second hand drawing him closer to the forbidden hour. The forbidden hour. Finally, the clock struck 12. A low chime echoed through the house, sending shivers down Oliver's spine. Desperate, despite himself, ignoring the sudden flutter of unease in his chest, he raised the mirror to his face and peered into the glass. Now, at first glance, there was nothing out of the ordinary. His own reflection stared back at him. The same tousled brown hair and mischievous blue eyes he saw every day. He waited half, expecting something to happen immediately, but the seconds ticked by and nothing changed. Oliver let out a relieved, albeit slightly disappointed laugh. Foolish tales, he muttered to himself, them ain't nothing. But as he moved to put the mirror down, something caught his eye. The reflection, his reflection, didn't lower the mirror with him. It remained raised, the glass still held in the reflection's hand, as if stuck in a moment that should have passed. Oliver froze, his heart skipping a beat. Slowly he lifted the mirror again, and the reflection smiled at him. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile that belonged to someone who knew secrets, who hoarded dark intentions. The smile grew wider, and Oliver noticed something else. His reflection's eyes, once identical to him, now glinted with a malevolent light, a spark of something not entirely human. "Hello, Oliver," the reflection said, its voice low and smooth, like silk sliding over steel. "Hello, Oliver." Oliver's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to drop the mirror, to smash it, but he couldn't move. The reflection's eyes held him captive, pulling him deeper, deeper, deeper into the glass. He watched in horror as the reflection began to move, lifting its hands to touch the glass from the inside in the same way. Oliver's hand held it from the outside. "I know what you want. I know what you want," the reflection continued, its smile never fading. "I know your dreams. I know your desires, and I can give them all to you." Oliver felt a chill run down his spine. His voice, when he finally found it, was barely more than a whisper. "Who are you? Who are you?" "I am you," the reflection replied through the sinister edge in its voice made it clear that this was the only half the truth, or at least I can be. Let me show you. Let me show you, Oliver. Let me give you everything you've ever wanted. A life of adventure, riches, power, anything you desire. Anything you want." Now Oliver's heart pounding in his chest. The promises were tempting, more tempting than anything he had ever imagined. A life of excitement, a life of wealth, and a life of influence, all within his grasp. But there was something else, something that gnawed at the back of his mind, a warning that he was treading into dangerous territory. "What's the catch?" Oliver said, his voice trembling. "What's the catch?" The reflection smiled, a dark promise gleaming in its eyes. "You must trade places with me. You must trade places with me. So come, step into the mirror, and I will step out. You'll have your dreams, and I will have mine." Oliver hesitated for a second, the cold dread in his stomach growing. The reflector's offer was too good to be true, and deep down he knew it. But the temptation was strong, the promise so alluring. He could feel the mirror's cold surface against his skin, its pull growing stronger with each passing second. Now the reflection watched him intensely, its smile never wavering. "What do you say, Oliver? What do you say? Are you ready to take the life you deserve?" Oliver swallowed hard, his mind racing. He knew the stories, the tales, the who's who. Everything had vanished. Everything had vanished. Then it happened. Are you ready to live the life you deserve? He pressed his hands firmly against the mirror, feeling it yield beneath his touch. The reflection winded, its hand closing against him, pulling him forward. The room around him winded, its hand closing against his, pulling him forward. The room around him began to blur, the edges of reality melting away as he stepped into the glass. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness, cold, endless darkness. Then slowly the world began to come back into focus. But it was wrong. The colors were muted, the air thick and heavy, like a world covered in a layer of grime. The light was dim, as though filtered through smoke, and the shapes around him twisted and distorted, like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Oliver's heart sank as he realized where he was. He was inside the mirror, trapped in a twisted version of his own world, leaving him to wonder this nightmarish landscape. "Wait!" Oliver cried, reaching out towards the glass. "Wait!" But his voice was swallowed by the oppressive darkness, his words echoing back at him in a mocking tone, his words echoing back at him in the most intense mocking tone you ever heard. And on the other side of the mirror, the reflection, his doppelganger, turned to face him. Its smile was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Oliver. You've given me everything I've ever wanted. Now enjoy your new home." "Enjoy your new home for eternity." With that, the creature turned away, walking into Oliver's life, leaving him trapped behind the glass. He pounded on the mirror, desperation clawing at his chest. "No, no, no, let me out, let me out. Please let me out. Help, but the glass remained, a cold barrier between him and the world he had lost. He watched in horror as the creature, now wearing his face, began to change everything. It twisted his life, turning friends into enemies and chaos wherever it went. The once bright future Oliver had dreamed of was corrupted by poison, by the creature's dark nature. Time passed very differently in the mirror world. Days felt like years, and Oliver could do nothing but watch as his life was warped and twisted beyond recognition. Warped and twisted beyond recognition, and the creature revealed in its new power, its control growing stronger with each passing day. It ruled with an iron fist, manipulating those around it with a current cunning that Oliver had never possessed. And while Oliver remained trapped in the mirror, a silent witness to the destruction of everything he had once helped decay. A silent witness to the destruction of everything he had once held dear, and he had traded places, and now he was paying the ultimate price, a price for a price far steeper than he could ever imagine. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Oliver had begun to wither. The mirror's promise had been a lie, a cruel trick to lure him into prison of his own making. And now he was condemned to live life eternity in the dark, twisted reflections of his world, forever longing for the life he had so foolishly given up. In the village of Black Hollow, the warnings live on. Never look into a mirror after midnight. Never look into a mirror after midnight. You have just heard the story of the mirror's promise. And as we venture into our second story, this story takes a turn so dark, so twisted. The question is, who is standing in the window? Who has the grinning face? I call this story The Grinning Man. In the quiet, peaceful town of Willow Creek, where everyone knew each other and nothing unusual ever seemed to happen, there was a story that sent shivers down the spines of even the bravest souls. The tale was of the Grinning Man, a sinister figure who appeared only at night, his face twisted in a goateed, permanent smile. The Grinning Man was said to haunt the streets, peering into the windows with wide, unblinking eyes, spreading fear wherever he went. Most dismissed the legend as a mere ghost story, something to frighten children and entertain the bored. But for those who claimed to have seen him, the memory that twisted grin was something they could never forget. You see, Sarah was one of the few in Willow Creek who had no time for ghost stories. A strong-willed and independent girl, she had always been brave, often scoffing at the town's superstitions. And the grinning man was just another tale, a tale she thought something invented to keep kids away from being out too late. But one cold moonlit night, as she was walking home from a friend's house, Sarah's skepticism would be tested. The night was still, the streets eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant bark of a dog's breaking silence. And as Sarah walked, she felt a slight chill, but she brushed it off, tightening her coat around her. It was then, out of the corner of her eyes, that she caught a glimpse of something, a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the street lamps. She stopped, her heart skipping a beat, and turned her head to get a better look. And then, there, half hidden by the darkness, stood a tall man. His face was obscured by the shadows, but something about the way he stood, so still, so unwaveringly rigid, made her blood run cold. He was watching her. She could feel it, but he didn't move. For a moment, Sarah considered calling out to him, but something deep inside her, a primal instinct, told her to keep walking. Just keep walking. She quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing in the quiet streets. And as she did, she heard it. Zero soft shuffling behind her. Sarah's pulse quickened, a sense of unease growing on at her. She slowly glanced over her shoulders, and there he was, still following her. The figure's movements were shallow, slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. She could see more of him now, the pale skin, the lanky frame, and the way he held his head, the way he tilted his head slightly to one side, as if curious. But it was his face that made her breathe. It was his face that made her breath catch her throat. Even from a distance, she could see the faint outline of a smile that seemed too wide, too unnatural. Panic set in. Sarah neared her house. She broke into a run, her footsteps pounding against the pavement, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. She didn't dare look back until she reached her front door. With shaking hands, she fumbled with her keys, trying desperately to fit the right ones to get inside and lock. It felt like an eternity before she finally got the door open. She burst inside, slamming the door shut behind her, the loud, long echoing through the empty house. For a moment, she pressed her back against the door, her heart racing as she tried to calm herself. But then, as dawn, as drawn by some horrible curiosity, she slowly turned back, her hand trembling. Taking a deep breath, she peered through the peephole, peephole, her eyes scanning the dark porch outside. At first, she saw nothing, just the empty street, the faint glow of the streaming street lamps, and the stillness of the night. But then, her breath caught her throat. There, standing just beyond the reach, was the grinning man. He was closer now, his features clearer. What she saw made her blood run cold. He was tall, unnaturally so, with a skeletal frame. His skin was deathly pale, almost luminescent in the moonlight, and his eyes, wide, unblinking, were fixed on the door. But it was his smile that terrified her the most. It stretched across his face in a way that seemed impossible, as if his lips had been carved into a permanent ghosty grin. And as she watched, that smile seemed to grow wider, more menacing, as if he knew she was watching him. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she blocked away from the door. As she backed away, her mind racing, she knew she had to do something, call for help, hide anything, but she couldn't move. She couldn't move. She couldn't move. The terror that gripped her was paralyzing, rooting her feet to that spot, as if she were a nightmare from which she couldn't awake. Then, without warning, there was a soft, deliberate knock on the door. 3 slow, measured taps that echoed throughout the silent house. Sarah's blood Sarah's blood ran stone cold. She stumbled backwards, her hands clamped over her mouth in a stifle. The knock came again, followed by a low, raspy voice that seemed to seep through the walls. "Let me in, Sarah. Let me in." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was enough to send a wave of terror crashing over her. How did he know who her name was? How could he know? His hand raced, her mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation, but there was none. She looked away further, her eyes now leaving the door. And then, as if a trance, she watched in horror as the doorknob slowly began to turn, the latch clinking softly as it was pushed open. The door creaked inward, revealing the dark silhouette of the grinning man standing on the threshold, his eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. But he didn't even enter. Instead, he stood there smiling, that horrific smile, his head tingling slightly as he stared at her face. Its face. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, and Sarth felt the air grow thick with a suffocating greed. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the grinning man stepped back into the shadows, his figure melting into the darkness. The door swung shut with a soft click, and the house fell silence once more. Sarah stood there, trembling, her mind relieving from what had just happened. But she finally mustered the courage to check the door. She found it locked, just as she had left it. Had it all been hallucinations, a trick of the mind? But then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the floor, just inside the door, was a small piece of paper. With shaking hands, she picked it up. Her breath caught as she says, "I'll see you soon, Sarah." "Keep smiling," said the grinning man. "I'll see you soon. Keep smiling." The paper slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the ground as a deep, overwhelming fear took hold of her. She would never feel safe again, never walk the streets at night without looking over her shoulders, and she would never, ever forget the face of the grinning man, for she knew deep down that he was still out there, watching, waiting, and that one day he would return. Thank you for watching and hearing the story of the grinning man. I want to say thanks to everyone in the live chat who was here witnessing this moment as we go deeper and deeper into the darkness, as each tale sends shivers down your spine, as each tale grows darker with every second, every tale more deeper, more darker than the one before it. That brings us to our third tale of the evening. I call this tale The Painting Door. At the edge of a once thriving town, where the streets now lay crooked and forgotten, stood a mansion, a relic of time. Life busted through the town's veins. The mansion, with its crumbling walls and overgrown gardens, had long been abandoned, its windows dark and empty like the hollow eyes of a ghost. But there was one feature of the mansion that had always stood out, a detail that made even the bravest of souls the door set up in the four the door set into the furthest corner of the mansion's main hallway. The paint was chipped and faded, the wood warped and splintered with age, but those who ventured close enough to truly look at it found themselves overwhelmed by a sense of dread, an implacable terror that seeped into the bones and gnawed at the saintly. The door was a mystery that had defied explanation for decades. The townspeople spoke of it in hushed tones, recounting stories of those who had tried to open it, only to be driven mad by what lay beyond. You see, for years the mansion remained empty, a moment that to the town's forgotten past, but that all changed. That all changed when a new family arrived, seeking to breathe the life back into their decaying structure. The family, the towns, had moved to the town in search of a fresh start. The father, David, had taken a job at the nearby factory, and his wife, Helen, had fallen in love with the minister's old wooden charm, the mansion's old wooden charm, its obvious state of disrepair. Their son Jacob, a quiet and curiosity boy of 12, was less enthusiastic about the move, but he soon found himself captivated by the mansion's secrets. From the moment they moved in, Jacob felt the pulse of the painted door. It was as though the door was alive, watching him, unseen eyes waiting for the night moment to reveal itself. Every time he walked by it, he felt a cold chill down his spine, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the door was somehow changing. New cracks, openings in the woods, fresh centers, fresh smears of paint that seemed to shift and move when he wasn't looking. The door seemed to beckon him, calling him in a voice that only he could hear. The rest of the family seemed obvious. The rest of the family seemed oblivious to the door's presence. David was preoccupied with his own work, but Helen busied herself with cleaning and storing the mansion's many rooms. But Jacob couldn't give it. Jacob could not ignore it. The door consumed his thoughts, filling his dreams with dark, twisted images that left him walking in a cold sweat. He tried to tell his parents, but they discovered something so awkward, so hideous, and so grotesque. And then one stormy night, as the winds howled through the trees and the rain against the windows, Jacob lay awake in his bed, the sound of the steam echoing to his ears. He was restless, his mind chumming with thoughts over the door. Unable to sleep, he decided to go downstairs, hoping to calm his nerves with a glass of water. And as he reached the bottom of the stairs, he heard it, a faint rhythmic knocking coming from behind the painted door. The sound was barely audible over the storm. It was sent as a jolt of fear through him. It sent a jolt of fear through him. His heart pounced in his chest as he approached the door, the knocking growing louder with each step. Standing before the door, Jacob hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on him like a weight. He held his breath, his fingers brushing against the old metal of the door. To his surprise, the door swung open at his touch. The room beyond was small, barely more than a closet dimly lit by a single layer flickering candles that had cast long dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something dark and unthinkable. Now Jacob's eyes wandered as he took into the sight before him. Walls covered in paintings, each one more disturbing than the past. The paintings depicted sense of terror and despair, twisted visions that seemed to crawl from the dark side corners of the human. Once showed a man trapped in a burning house, his face controlled in agony and flames licked at his skin. Another depicted a woman drawing in a sea of black, her hands clawing at the surface, as she was dragged down into the depths. Each painting was vivid, so lifelike that felt as though he could never Jacob felt as though he could hear the screams of the figures trapped within the frames. And as he moved deeper into the room, Jacob's gaze was drawn to a painting in the center of the wall. It was longer than the others. Its frame omitted and glided, but what caught his attention was the scene. It showed a family standing outside the mansion, their faces turned towards the viewer. The father was tall and strong, the mother gracefully and kind, and the boy looked exactly like Jacob. His heart raced as he realized that the paintings was of his own family, captured in perfect detail as they had opened their own cards. They moved into the mansion. The figures were frozen in time, their expression blank, almost lifeless. But as Jacob stepped out of the painting, the figures seemed to shift, their faces slowly twisting into expression of fear and anguish. The boy's eyes, once bright with curiosity, were now wide with terror, his mouth open in a silent stream. horrified by Jacob, stumbled into backwards, his breath. The candle flickered widely, casting a grotesque shadow on the walls as the paintings seemed to close in around him. And folks, Jacob pounced on the door, his fist bruising against the wall. Help! Let me out! Help! 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 He screamed, but the voices were swallowed by the darkness, the walls closing in tighter, the air growing thick and suffocating. The painting, the painted figures on the wall seemed to reach out towards him, their twisted faces filled with malice and despair, in a last desperate attempt to erase. Jacob threw himself at the door, but it was no use. The room was alive with a malevolent force, and it had calmed him on his own. The last thing Jacob ever saw before the darkness consumed him was his own reflection in the window. The next morning the mansion was quiet, the storm having passed in the night. Helen and David awoke to find their son's bed empty, his room undisturbed. Panic set in as they searched the house, calling his name, but there was no sign of Jacob anywhere. It was as though it was as though everything changed at that very moment. The Tanners felt the mansion that very day, unable to bear the weight of the loss and the darkness that hung over the house. The mansion once again fell into despair, its secrets hidden behind the locked doors and peeling point. But those who passed by the old house will sometimes speak of the painting. The painted door remains closed, its secrets locked away, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to seek the truth. That was the story of the painted door. Now, I want to take this moment to give thanks to everyone in the chat room. For those of you that are still here, you are a fan of Dr. Fright. And thank you to everybody in the chat room. You are here at just the right moment as we take this next story all the way to the depths of the unknown. We take this next story very heavily cautious, as I call this the Headless Horseman. The story of the Headless Horseman. This story dates back many years. In the village of Black Hollow, nestled deep within a valley surrounded by dark, ancient woods, the people lived in constant fear of the Headless Horseman. The legend had been passed down through generations. each telling more terrifying than the last. And then, on foggy nights, when the mist rolled in thick and heavy, and the horsemen had worked their behinds off, now, you see, William, a boy 15 with a taste for adventure and a stubborn disbelief in old superstitions, had heard the story many times before. The villagers would gather around the hearth, their faces lit by flickering flames, and speak in hushed tones of those who had disappeared into the woods, never to return, never to return, never to return. But William was not like other villagers. He scoffed at the fear, dismissed the legends of nothing more than a tale of sore children. He was determined to prove that the headless horseman was that just simply a myth, a flickering fragment of their imaginations. One peculiar foggy night, when the air was thick with mist and the moon was hidden behind a veil of clouds, William decided to venture into the woods. He was certain that the villagers were wrong. He was certain that there was nothing out there. He was certain only trees and shadows. But ignoring the warnings of his mother and the pleas of his girlfriends and friends, he set out with a lantern to light the way, determined to explore the forest and uncover the truth. And as William walked, the sounds of the villages faded into the distance, replaced by the eerie silence of the forest. The trees towered down him, the branches twisted around. The fog curled around the feet, swirling it thick and heavy. Heavy trindles, not seeming to put them over too well. Despite his initial confidence, a sense of unease began to creep over him. The air was cold and damp. The sailors, the silence, everything was very, very quiet. The deeper William ventured, the more thick the fog became, until it became almost impossible to see. More than a few feet ahead, he could no longer tell which direction he was going. The trees all looked the same, their twisted forms luring back of the mist speakers. Just as he was beginning to consider turning back, he heard it, the distant sound of hooves pouncing on the ground. The second sound grew louder, the ground beneath his feet vibrating with each heavy thud. He stumbled his eyes, peering into the fog, and then he saw it, a dark figure on horseback emerging from the mist, like a wraith, the headless horseman. The rider was just one of the legends he had described, tall and imposing. His headless body drooped into a tattered cloak that billowed out behind him like the wings of a giant bat. The horse he made, the horse he rode was a massive beast, its cost as black as night, with eyes that glowing a deep malevolent red. The horseman's sword, long and gleaming, was held high in one hand, ready to strike. That's when panic began to set in. Panic surged through William as the horseman charged towards him, the sound of the hooves growing deeper and deeper. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the forest floor as he fled through the fog. The branches of the trees clawed at him, tearing at his clothes and skin, but he didn't dare slow down. He could feel the horsemen closing in, the chill of death in the air as the ghostly rider bore down on him. And just as the horseman's sword sliced through the air, William tripped over a gnarled root and fell to the ground, the blade missing him by the mere inches. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding and pounding in his chest. But as he looked around, he realized something terrifying. The horseman was not chasing him. Instead, the specter rider was leading him, desperate more and more. You see, the horseman was not chasing him. Instead, the rider was leading him deeper into the woods, steering him towards something he had not noticed before, an ancient, overgrown grave. Now you see the grave was marked by a crumbling headstone, covered in mess and nearly obscured by the roots of the forest. The horseman dismounted from his horse, the movement eerie and silent. With a bony hand, he pointed to the grave, the gesture slow and deliberate. Now William started in horror, understanding downing too late. The legend had not warned him of this. The horseman was not searching for a replacement head. He was searching for a saucer. The ground beneath William's feet began to shift, the earth opening up with a deep guttural rumble. The fog thickened, wrapping around him like a shrewd and grave. The horseman stood motionless, watching as William was slowly dragged towards the open grave. He tried to fight, to scramble away, but the pull of the earth was too strong. As he was swallowed by the ground, the last thing William saw was the horseman mounting his steer once more, the red glow of the horse's eyes piercing the fog. The horseman rode away. Disappearing into the mist, his curse passed on to a new victim. The earth closed over William, and the worlds fell silent once more. And the next thing the villagers found, William hut at the very edge of the woods, lying abandoned in the dirt. There was no sign of the boy, no trace of where he had gone, but as they stood at the edge of the forest, they found it, the faint distant sound of the horseman. And you see, and they knew with a deep chilling certainty that the headless horseman had found his successor. Because you see, as they stood at the edge of the forest, they heard it, the faint distant sound of hooves echoing through the trees, growing fainter as it folded into the night sky. And they knew, with a deep chilling certainty, that the headless horseman had not died. Instead, had found his next successor. You have just heard the tale of the Headless Horseman, which proves to everybody here that you are now a fan of the Fright Files. And as we venture deeper and deeper into the night sky, we go from the Headless Horseman. We go even deeper to the depths of hell. Because you see, there is a story so earth-shattering, a story so dark, a story so weird, you almost can't stand the ending when you get there. But as we approach this next story, I want you to remember one thing, that you have made it this far. Can you go the distance? Can you go the full length to become fans of the Fright Files? I call this story The Harvest Man. You see, in the heart of a spawning countryside, where fields of golden wheat stretch endlessly towards the horizon, there lies a small village with a haunting tradition. Each year, as the harvest season approaches, the villagers whisper about the harvest man, a scarecrow-like figure said to come to life when the moon is full and the crops are ripe. The harvest man is said to believe to be the guardian of the fields, ensuring that the crops flourish and the village thrives. But with his protection comes a dark price. It is said that the harvest man demands a sacrifice to guarantee a beautiful harvest. It's said that the harvest man demands a sacrifice to guarantee a beautiful harvest, a life to be taken and buried in the soil. Riley, a strong-willed and patient girl, had grown up hearing the tales of the harvest man. Like most of the villagers' youth, she dismissed the stories as nothing more than a superstition, meant to scare children into the obedience. Her family, like many others, relied on the fields for their livelihood, and as the harvest season neared, Riley found herself working late in the evenings, her hands colored from her hours spent pulling weeds and harvesting crops. And then it happened, folks. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Riley lingered in the fields, lost in her thoughts. The air was cool and crisp, the first hint of autumn in these breezes. As she worked, she noticed a strong movement. At first, Riley thought nothing of it, just another scarecrow to place and scare the birds, but as she continued to walk, she couldn't shake the feeling of fatigue. Somebody watching her. Every time she glanced up, the scarecrow seemed to have shifted it slightly, its head tilted in her direction, as if observing her every move. The thought sent chills down her spine, but she shook it off, telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. And as night fell, the fields grew eerily quiet. The sounds of day, the rustling of the leaves, the chirping of the crickets were replaced by an unsettling stillness. Riley was about to call it a night and head home when she heard it, faint rhythmic tapping, like the sounds of something sharp striking through the earth. She paused, her heart pounding in her chest, straining to hear more. The tapping grew louder, closer, accompanied by the rustle of something moving through the crops. Glancing up, Riley's breath caught in her throat. The scarecrow, the harvest man, was no longer at the edge of the field. It was much closer now, its tall, spindly front illuminated by the pole light of the moon. The figure was more defined, its body seemingly made of twisted vines and hay with long skeletal arms that alongside dangled. Its burlap head was tilted at unnatural angles, and from within the stitched eyes glowing on eerie, unnatural light. Panic surged through Riley as the harvest man began to move, its long limbs carrying it toward her with slow, deliberate steps. She turned and ran, the tall stalks of what happened against her legs as she fled. But the harvest man was relentless, its strides unnaturally long, chasing the distance between them, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. Riley's heart pounced in her ears, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she raced towards the village. But just as she thought she might see an escape, she felt something cold and rough coil around her, the harvest man's arms. It could even be cold than Riley screamed, thrusting and kicking in despair, attempting to free herself, but the harvest man's grip was unyielding. It dragged her backwards, pulling her towards the edge of the field, where the earth had been freshly turned, a gaping pit waiting for its next occupant. As Riley struggled, the harvest man leaned over her, its grotesque face hovering inches from hers. When it spoke, its voice was a low, raspy whisper, like the rustling of the leaves in the wind. A sacrifice must be made. A sacrifice must be made. It informed its breath, cold against her skin. It intoned its breath against her skin. The fields demanded it. The earth must be fed. Riley's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of terror and disbelief. She clawed at the ground, trying to find purchase, but the harvest man's strength was overwhelming. With a final desperate cry, she tried to plead with the figure to reason it with it. But her words were swallowed by the darkness. The harvest man eyes glowed brighter as it dragged her into the pit, its bony hands shoveling earth over her struggling mouth. The sail was cold and heavy, pressing down on her, filling the mouth and nose. cutting off her tail, cutting off her air. The last thing Riley saw before the darkness claimed her was the harvest man standing too tall above her. Its burlap sack had turned towards the village, as if making its next victim. The next morning the villagers awoke to find the fields lush and full, the crops more abundant than ever before, but Riley was nowhere to be found. Her family searched the fields, calling her name, but there was no trace of her. In the center of the field, the harvest man stood, its form as still and silent as it had always been, and most slightly thinking. See, the villagers knew what had happened, though no one dared to speak about it. The harvest man had claimed its sacrifice, and the village wouldn't prosper for another year. But they also knew one thing very important. They also knew that the time would come again when the fields grew their more burden, and the harvest man would rise above, more demanding another life to feed the earth. And so the cycle continued year after year, the harvest man standing watching over the fields, waiting patiently for the next harvest. You have just heard the tale of the harvest man. I want to give a shout out to every brave soul in the chat room, for you are fans of the Fright Files. If anybody has any questions or anything they want to ask, please put it in the chat room. I will be sure to answer each and every question in the coming days. And now we move on to the next haunting tale. I call this next tale a tale so frightful. It is known simply as the elevator. You see, as the glitches on the screen, the same glitches occurred that night on the elevator. A family whose was not hunting for money. Well, it was their 8-year-old son's birthday. So they decided to take him shopping in the city. It was a very busy day, as usual. When the boy had his gifts, they were giving down to the subway to get across the city. The family went on their own to get across the subway. They got off the train and headed for the elevators. When the doors opened, there were many people in there already. They were all adults whose families and who were fairly big fellows. The boy dared to go into the elevator, leaving behind his parents. The parents tried to get in the elevator, but it was too late. The elevator's doors were closed and was heading right on up. The parents rode on up the other elevators the same time the boy went up. When the doors opened, they thought they would meet their son. Well, they didn't see him anywhere in the crowd. In fact, they didn't even see him get off the elevator. So the parents looked over through the crowds, but they didn't find their son. They quickly called the cops, and they arrived very quickly. A detective was sent on the case. First thing to do was to check the elevators. The detective found a button and showed it to the boy's parents. They agreed that it was the son's button from the shirt. Next thing was the detective. The next thing the detective did was watch all of the security cameras. He obviously went to watch the elevator camera recordings. He saw the big man and all the other people who surrounded him. He also saw the boy enter the elevator. After that, he couldn't see much because a person got in front of the camera. He watched the camera that showed every little thing, everyone filling out the elevator. But there was no sign of the boy leaving the elevator. Still, he thought he knew the big bearded man in the elevator with the boy from somewhere. He did some research and found out who the man was. He was a man who went on an expedition to Antarctica. The last communication and had they lost communication and had to survive. Many of his friends had died on that short. They had ran short of food, so they had to eat his friends to live. The other people in the elevator were also survivors in the man's group. They also resorted to cannibalism to live. The detective decided to meet with him. He easily found the address. He lived in the city, so it was not hard to find him. The detective had an interview with the man. So, were you on the elevator the other day, November 12th? The detective asked. Yes, I was. Did you ever happen to see a little boy in the elevator riding up with you? Yes, I did. I'm surprised his parents weren't with him. Yes, well, did you ever see him leave the elevator by any chance? I don't think so. I was one of the first people out, and there was a pretty big crowd, okay, because that little boy had turned up missing and was reported not coming out of the elevator. Yes, well, that is quite sad, and I wish I could help, but I don't see him leave myself. Well, thank you for your time. I'll do anything to help. And oh, and by the way, check out my book I wrote from when I was with my crew in Antarctica. I think it isn't too bad for a book I wrote. I'll be sure to do that. Thanks. The detective left and went to the library to pick up the man's book. The detective read the book, and in the next few days, the book was about how hard it was to live. It said many but his it said how many but of his best friends died on that trip and how they were like his brothers. But the one way to live was to eat the corpse of the head of his dead friends. It was a horrible feeling, he had said, but he would do anything to have the sweet taste of life. And after reading the book that afternoon, he replayed all the footage in the elevator. He studied the man and all the friends. Something just didn't feel quite right about this. He watched all of them walk out, but still not the boy. He swallowed he slowly played the footage over and over and over again. He saw a cone in one of the person's hands. He also saw a ball in the other person's hand. All of them were wearing backpacks for some odd reason. That wasn't That's when it clicked. What if the man and all of his crew were still cannibals? What if they didn't die like the fact of eating someone at first to live? But what if they got to use it all eventually started to enjoy? He studied the camera footage one last time and thought how much that cone looked like a leg or arm, or how that oval ball looked like a foot. Sadly, he couldn't really see it. It was or wasn't and couldn't not get enough evidence. But what he thought was cozy is how there was not one drop of blood in the elevator. You have just heard the story of the elevator. Do you yourself dare to go into the elevator alone? I want to thank you for coming and being a part of the Fright Files here tonight. I want to thank everybody in the chat room who was watching and enjoyed our show. For you are fans of the Fright Files. And thank everybody who has survived and made it this far. Until next time, this is Dr. Fright. Stay wicked, stay frightful, and we will see you next week for another episode of the Fright Files.